Here we are. There we go. Oh, there we are. Good. I'll square it up. You just take care of one little bit of business. Sorry about that. Taking care of some quick work-related business on the radio. Yeah. And swipe that notification off. Eesh. God, try to clean my lens there. Sorry about that. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Byron Insidious. And it is once again a break time story time. We are going to continue with the presentation of A Midwestern Yankee in King Ovin's Court, as written by yours truly. Reading off of the manuscript that I've got saved here on my Kindle, we'll pick up where we left off. Driving through any part of Minneapolis, Kathy could tell anyone who asked, was an exercise in anger management and risk-taking. Most drivers in the Twin Cities, from her perspective, operated on the presumption that so long as there was no explicit sign telling them not to do something, they could, in fact, do it, or attempt to. This included such charming activities as making a left turn from the far right lane, suddenly slamming on one's brakes for no clear or apparent reason, and charging across 3 lanes of traffic just to pass a single car and then cut all the way back over to make their exit ramp. Kathy's response to these behaviors was usually, like that day, to scream at the other drivers impotently, to flip them off, and to parrot their actions to demonstrate how annoying they were. She drove along cautiously, thinking the whole while, welcome to Minnesota, where road rage isn't a problem, it's a fucking philosophy. She swerved around the suddenly slowing van and continued on her way. By the time Kathy got off the busier streets and into the quiet little neighborhood housing magical things, her knuckles were white, her heart rate was up, and her temper frayed. She slowed her car, nicknamed Duchess, to a near crawl as her phone's GPS robotically instructed her that her destination was just ahead, on the left. Kathy spotted the small building, turning into its parking lot a minute later. The lot was enormous, and it had no neighboring buildings for nearly 100 yards to the west and south. It was more than a corner lot. In urban terms, it was a veritable estate. Kathy parked Duchess in an empty space in the middle of the lot, taking note of the lone other vehicle present, a beat-up old Ford Ranger. She could see various boondoggles hanging from the truck's rearview mirror, and a pair of arcane symbols painted on the tailgate told her that it belonged to the proprietor of the store. As Kathy approached the storefront, she began to feel slightly lightheaded, as if she'd been out in the sun for hours instead of moments. A shimmering corona of heat waved over the store's exterior, giving off a peculiar burnt scent. What the hell is that? She asked out loud. Kathy Potts stepped closer to the building and saw flitting lights of green and purple jumping off of the structure. She reached cautiously for the doorknob and watched as a golden light flowed out of the door and up onto her arm. What? She managed, before a bolt of purple energy, electricity, she thought, blasted down into her hand. Pain filled Kathy's body for a good 10 seconds before the darkness dragged her down, out of the waking world. Greetings, Sarge. Good to have you here, brother. Chapter 2. Nighttime. Kathy groaned, her merciful reprieve from the sudden pain of what she thought must have been an electrical shock washing away. Stiffness in her neck, arms, and legs, coupled with an achiness that ran through every muscle in her body, left her wondering if she had been mistaken, if the building might have blown up or something. Her eyes cracked open into little slits, letting the blur of her environment make its initial impression on her sense of sight. Scent already turned in its report to her brain, antiseptics and clean institutional linens. The consistent beep of some device in sync with her heart added to her conclusion of where she was. Hospital, she croaked. Blech, is that my voice? She thought. It's like the crypt keeper with tits and a cold. Uncharitable thoughts about her own voice aside, she felt incredibly lucky to know that she was at least still alive. She reached up to rub at her eyes to clear them, tugging on an IV line as she did. The room she was in had the look of a medium to long-term patient to it, one that she recognized. She had been in rooms like this too many times, but before it had always been as a visitor. She pushed thoughts of such things aside. By slow degrees, she came more awake, looking to the windows to her right. The curtains were open, but the night was dark, shedding almost no light whatsoever into the room. A look to the left revealed a small rolling tray with a water pitcher on it with a straw. Kathy put the straw in and, with an effort, brought the pitcher to herself so that she could drink. 4 measured, evenly spaced sips, and she felt like a new person. She was always struck by how little it took sometimes to make a person feel better. She now sat up, and despite her body's protests, she swung herself down off the bed. She wobbled, one hand on the bed for balance, the other holding her IV feed stand. When she felt confident again, she moved with dreadful slowness to the little bathroom to relieve herself. When she got back to the bed, she removed the bedpan provided and set it under the bed. She was still sore, but a strange noise from the hallway, like a dog's claws on the tile flooring, caught her attention. She shambled over to the door of her room, already open a crack, and peered out into the hall. What she saw instantly burned itself into her memory. At the door to another room farther down the hall stood 2 giant cockroaches the size of Rottweilers. Their thread-like antennae twitched back and forth, and a sickly green light flowed in a gaseous stream from inside the room into mouths that she saw were great gaping mandibles. She let out a girlish squeak of terror and revulsion. When the 2 creatures whipped their heads in her direction, she bolted back to her bed, her sore body fueled by fear. Kathy tucked herself under the sheets on the hospital bed, curled up like a child hiding from the monster in the closet. She dared lift part of the sheet only enough to peer at her doorway, though. The click-clack chittering of insectile legs echoed through the hallway and her room, and moments later, one of the gigantic bugs poked its head in. Its antennae twitched and twirled, but it made no sound or other movement. Kathy remained perfectly still, her every instinct screaming at her to flee, to dive out the window. Except, however, for a very small voice amid the clamoring inner shouts of alarm and terror. That tiny, barely perceptible voice said, "Such things always hunt the weak and the hurt and the frightened. Be cool." Kathy did as this small voice bade, and after half a minute, the roach thing slipped away, scuttling off with its partner, 6 pairs of legs clacking on the floor tiles. When the bugs were out of earshot, Kathy felt suddenly fatigued, and she fell into a deep, natural sleep. The night prowled the darkened city streets of Minneapolis under a heavy blue cloak, hood up, shadows magically held in a swirling pattern around his head. His talents with magic were few, but this much he could handle. It was necessary, for even the slightest sight of him by a human would result in fear and chaos, ripping through their brains. The knight wore a heavy chain shirt and leggings beneath his cloak, the shirt covered by durable half-plate armor, padded with patches of leather to muffle its movements. The leggings were similarly muted by a thin pair of black trousers, worn over hardened leather boots. A long sword was sheathed at each hip, drawstrings looped through holes in the hilts to avoid the weapons sliding out during moments when they might normally slip free. The knight ducked down yet another alley, coming to a halt. He threw back his hood when he was sure no humans were in sight, revealing the head of a German shepherd upon his humanoid body. His nose twitched as he picked up a familiar scent, one that he hadn't smelled in years. "Gailof," he said, his voice rumbly yet noble. He drew the hood up once again and started away. His mission, personally given him by King Ovin, was to go to the damaged twinning, check on the damage, and go from there to the home of the human whose essence had been struck by the twinning's tainted aura. The dog-headed knight, a member of the Kenyan race, Dogman Fairy, had picked up the human's faint trace of essence, now had to go where she lived. He could also detect the residue left behind by the wildfire that had swept through the region. A ritual had been used, had to have been, for the energy to still linger the way it did. He conjured shadows once more about himself and moved along, thinking about the implications of what he had observed thus far. The sage who had been in control of the twinning, a hobby shop in its mortal plane incarnation, had been an elderly man known to the knight as Calkins-Treworgy, a friend of Ovin's court for many years. He had come outside into the lot when the knight approached, hands raised in welcome. The knight had grinned and greeted him happily. "Garland," the Kenyan knight said, embracing the old human. "Sir Daguerreau," the human sage replied, clapping the knight on the back. Daguerreau asked about the human woman, and Garland confirmed that he had sensed her and her predicament even in the back storeroom of the shop. "I called 911 and gave them a line about how hot it had been out, that she must have been dehydrated and passed out in front of my store." "A smart move, my friend," Daguerreau replied. He had taken his leave of the sage, and 5 minutes later caught Gailof's odor. He wondered what the centaur would have to say about recent events. That would have to take a back seat for the moment, though. His king had been very clear in instructions, and a man like Daguerreau, for whom duty and honor came above all other things, could not ignore them. And so he stalked down the alley, the trace of the human woman's essence pulling at his senses. It had been long and long, many and many, as the fairy put it, since he had crossed over to the mortal plane for longer than a few minutes. Daguerreau didn't care much for the world that humans dominated. To start with, the air was filthy, especially in larger cities. In the Aether plane, even in the capital of the Ammermit's kingdom, the city known as Celia, he could stand atop a tall building and see clear beyond the outer walls for dozens of miles. The second thing he disliked about the mortal plane was the technology. The world of Faerie, the Aether, was rich with magic, so technology was very nearly a forgotten pursuit there. Humans, few of whom had access to arcane powers, made up for their lack of magic with the advancements of science. This included his two most reviled forms of technology, guns and automobiles. The former turned anyone into a potential threat, regardless of skill or even intentions. And the latter, Daguerreau felt, made people lazy and drove them apart rather than bringing them together. Daguerreau ran along sidewalks and down alleys, climbed the sides of buildings, and leaped from rooftop to rooftop, trying at all times to avoid being spotted. At one point he found himself in a residential neighborhood, passing through a park, when the sound of approaching voices forced him to press himself against a tree, drawing shadows around himself. There were, he realized, 3 sets of feet nearby, approaching a position only 10 feet away. From the east came a single scruffy-looking young man, pale and sickeningly narrow, a dark blue hooded sweatshirt worn over torn jean shorts and black low-top sneakers. He trembled as he walked, his mouth slack, revealing pitted gums and jagged teeth. From the west came 2 burly men dressed like the kind of street thugs one could see in a police procedural show like Law and Order. Daguerreau had to give the humans that much. He enjoyed their forms of entertainment. The thugs each carried an automatic pistol tucked into their waistbands, and the shorter of the 2, his forearms and neck festooned with tattoos, carried a brown paper sack in his left hand. Daguerreau slowly moved his hands to the hilts of his weapons, undoing the tie-downs, silently. He didn't want to draw blades against humans, but he would if necessary. The 3 men stopped a few feet away from one another. The younger man shuffled nervously, looking around conspicuously, biting his fingernails. Drug deal, Daguerreau thought. The younger man nodded at the dealers and said, "That mine?" "Could be it is," said the one holding the baggie. "You got the necessary funds?" The buyer produced a tight roll of $20 bills and tossed it at the dealer's feet. "Whoops, dropped my money," the buyer said with a dopey smile. The dealer held the baggie out before him at arm's length and released it. "Oh, would you look at that? I dropped my bag. Hope nobody grabs it," he said theatrically, crouching down to snatch up the money. He turned his head suddenly towards the tree against which Daguerreau stood, eyes narrowed. "What's up, Gus?" the other dealer asked in a squeaky voice. Daguerreau gripped his sword handles, breathing deeply, centering himself. The dealer named Gus slowly stood up, eyes still locked on the shadow-concealed Kenyan knight. "Nothing, man," the man finally said, looking to the buyer. "Go on, get out of here," he barked, and the junkie darted away dutifully. Gus and his partner started to walk off, and Daguerreau could hear him say, "For a minute there, it felt like the devil was watching me from inside that fucking tree, man." "No devil, but watched you were indeed, fellow," Daguerreau thought. He refastened the tie-downs on his weapons and resumed his trek north. King Ovin knew the human was a woman, and that she needed to be appraised of her situation. More than that, she needed to be told of what exactly had happened to her, so that she didn't run crazy. Such things happened often after newly awakened humans were put through such trauma. A member of the Fairy Kingdom the afflicted human resided beside almost always was sent to help them cope with their newfound reality. Seldom was the Fairy sent as high in rank and status as Sir Daguerreau, High Knight of Ovin's court and the Ammermit's kingdom. The Kenyan knew that something seriously foul was going on within the kingdom, something most likely involving Luga, a shade who routinely caused chaos within Ovin's realms. But King Ovin had explained little else to Daguerreau, and what he did tell the High Knight, Daguerreau could not decipher the significance of. Another series of alleys and emptied side streets passed around the concealed Fairy as he followed the trail. The sense of the city itself was an affront to his nostrils, the stench of exhaust fumes and cigarettes and chemicals heavy around him. He couldn't understand how the humans put up with it, much less local dogs. Speaking of cigarettes. After another 20 minutes, Daguerreau stood in a mostly empty parking lot, an apartment complex before him. It was of the sort that was shaped like a horseshoe, with iron steps at the end of each floor's walkway leading up and down. 4 stories high, he could see that each apartment except the ones on the ends of each level were one-bedroom affairs. The trail of the human woman's essence led him up to an apartment on the 2nd floor, on the western side of the horseshoe. He grasped the doorknob and tried to turn it, but it stuck. Locked, he muttered aloud. Quickly, he checked to see if he was being observed, then wrenched on the knob, snapping its inner lock latch mechanisms. He slipped inside without a word. Eyes were upon him the moment he entered. Daguerreau brought up his hands into a pugilist's stance, then spotted the turtle-shell cat staring at him from the couch in the living room that the apartment door opened upon. The cat meowed at him, then set its head back on its paws, ignoring him. He sighed and shook his head. It was a simple apartment, of a kind that he had seen many humans living in. Hell, he'd seen plenty of Faerie live in such dwellings as well. The human-like elves, only physically different by way of their pointed ears, slightly shorter stature, and double-jointed arms and legs, tended to prefer very similar dwellings. A piece of paper had been left on the counter in the woman's small kitchen. It read, "Kathy, I took care of Tigger while you were in HCMC. Love, Mom." A quick sweep of her apartment turned up plenty of signs that Kathy was already at least subliminally aware of the ether. Many humans like her were drawn to what the humans called fantasy literature and games. She could well have seen something of the Faerie at some point in her life. Now that he had found her home, Sir Daguerreau willed open a rift between the worlds and slipped into the in-between to await her return to her home. That return would be short-lived, but he didn't want to terrify her by just being there when she came home. Sir Daguerreau was, if nothing else, a gentleman, after all. Where I will cut the reading for tonight. No, he did not eat the cat. Sir Daguerreau is he's a good boy. The Kenin are nobler creatures. He would not eat a domesticated feline. I know you were worried about Tigger, Sarge, but Tigger is going to be just fine. But that brings us to the end of chapter 2, which is essentially serves as an introduction in its entirety to Sir Daguerreau, a Kenin Faerie knight, the High Knight of King Ovin's court. Yeah, pretty much, Sarge. Yeah, you see, unlike them, Daguerreau, who you would think would be inclined to at least chase the cat around the apartment, did nothing to it. Just kind of saw it and went, oh, okay, nothing to worry about here. But yes, that's the end of chapter. That is the entirety of chapter 2. Kind of wrapped up the end of chapter 1 and got through all of chapter 2 in tonight's reading. So that's where we're at right now. And I don't know if I'm going to be doing a break time show tomorrow and Sunday, or if I'm going to take the next few days off of the break time readings. I'm not 100% sure just yet. No, and there's a reason for that, Sarge. There's a reason why Tigger just kind of looked up, went, "Oh, okay," and then put his head back down. And I will get that. The explanation for that will be revealed as we proceed further into the story. The Kathy Potts novels It was when I wrote them, it was a trilogy. And I did end up writing one more story as sort of a side story spin-off called that came later on, a few years after I finished the last Kathy Potts novel. There's a Midwestern Yankee in King Owen's Court, which is the first one. There's The Chained One, which is the second Kathy Potts novel. And there's Kingdom No More, the third and final entry in the primary Kathy Potts trilogy. The spin-off novel is entitled This is M Division. And the reason I refer to it as a spin-off and not an actual Kathy Potts novel is it's set in the same world, the same realm as the Kathy Potts trilogy. It's set in our world, but parallel to the Aether, the fairy realm. And Kathy does show up in that novel, as does Sir Daggero. To avoid spoilers, I won't get into any further details about This is M Division, other than to say the other reason why it's more of a spin-off is that in This is M Division, the story primarily focuses on members of an organization known as M Division. It is a subdivision of Interpol that's much like the X-Files for the FBI, except their area of interest is the magical and the supernatural. And it's not like they're trying to prove the existence of fairy and magic. They full well know about the Aether and the fairy, and their entire purpose is to investigate incidents involving fairy in the mortal plane. We may eventually get there. I don't know how many of these stories I intend to do as presentations here during these streams. I want to kind of get a feeling for it as we go along through the presentation of Midwestern Yankee first. And then I'll kind of gauge if I want to continue on with this presentation series of Storytime Break Time. And I have one more smoke, and then I got to get back into work. But do you have any, if there's anyone in the chat, if you have any questions, comments, concerns thus far about the story, by all means, feel free to lob those questions at me. The small press and indie publishing scene is kind of a shit show right now. So even if your question is generally speaking just about publishing, the last few days have been interesting. I had to deal with a scammer yesterday and today. Someone pretending to be a literary agent, trying to scam me out of my own work. That was fun. Well, thank you, Sarge. The Kathy Potts novels are a little bit more like the first two, rather. Midwestern Yankee and even The Chained One are a little bit more light-hearted fantasy, more along the lines of what I do in my Temerarian Tales stories and novels. Kingdom No More is not lighthearted. I dove a little bit more into the grim and the unpleasant, but not without good reason. And the creature that is the primary antagonist in The Chained One, his background story, his origin story is deeply unpleasant. But there's always reasons for these things. I couch a lot of my urban fantasy, which is what Kathy Potts novels would be technically classified as. I couch most of my urban fantasy in a slightly darker tone than my Tamalarian tales, which is just straight up swords and sorcery, epic high fantasy in the realm of Tamalaria. I'm glad you're enjoying it thus far, Sarge. And I hope anyone else who is watching and has not chimed in yet. Um, no, he was not groomed by Pedo Joe. Bear in mind, um, hold on a second. I need to look that up actually, because I can't remember, which is a bad thing that I don't remember. Let me see. Oh, this is page 15. I gotta remember. All right. I first copyrighted Midwestern Yankee and King Ovin's Court back in 2013. That's when the book first came out. 2013. So this is an 11-year-old novel that I am sharing in this series of presentations. I mean, shit, in 2013, Pedo Joe was still the vice president. He had not yet ascended to the ranks of potato in chief, rotting potato in chief. So, yeah. Sorry about that. But anyhow, I'm just going to call it. I'm going to wrap it up here. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Break Time Story Time with your host, Joshua T. Calkins-Treworgy, Byron of Sidious. I'd like to thank you for tuning in once again. If you're a returning viewer, if you're new, thanks for giving it a try. And I hope to see you back again sometime in the future. You are always welcome to enjoy a tale in this particular storyteller's corner. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves. And as always, keep reading.